Alrighty, we're gonna get started here. Thanks for joining us with our R3 webinars series. Their monthly series we've been doing. And today we have Charles Evans of the Department of Natural Resources in Georgia. And he is going to talk about what he did to step down the national plan into a plan that state could use and follow. Since the national plan is so big and so large, he took a long time. It took maybe around a year or so to really boil down the plan to what can Georgia do right now. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he can tell you about his process. So Charles, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Marty. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. Well, first off, I just want to say I've really enjoyed the webinars that y'all have hosted that have been produced in the past few months, and I'm definitely excited to get to share a little bit about what we have going on in Georgia. So a big thank you to Sam, Marty, and Cyrus for putting it together. Today, we're going to talk about the process we went through in Georgia to create a state-specific plan. But before we jump straight into the plan creation, I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about how this initiative began and a little bit about the formation of my position as well. So starting from the beginning, the inception of the R3 movement as we know it in Georgia, representatives from the Georgia DNR Wildlife Resources Division and the National Wild Turkey Federation have been involved in the National Plan Development Work Group since its formation. So they were very vested in R3 and the strategic data-driven approach. In fact, Dan Forrester, who was the director of the Georgia DNR Wildlife Resources Division at the time this position came online, was actually the chair of the council his last year as director. He now works for ATA as director of government relations, but he really wanted to see a state level coordinator hired and ensure that Georgia had a state specific plan in place to make sure we were taking that strategic approach. So working with NWTF, the Georgia DNR started the beginning stages of this memorandum of understanding for a shared R3 coordinator position, and that all began around February of 2015. So moving forward from there, they had a Georgia R3 meeting in April of 2015. It was the first one. They brought in Matt Dunphy from the Wildlife Management Institute and stakeholders from agency, NGO, and industry with a vested interest in hunting and shooting sports in Georgia. First thing they did is they went over a state of the state, if you will. What's happening with the status of hunting and shooting in Georgia. And then Matt went into the national status of R3 and where R3 is headed, where it's been, and a little bit of the background, since a lot of these stakeholders, this was their first time hearing of R3. Of course, they did some mapping with the outdoor recreation adoption model. This was very preliminary, but it gave people an idea of where programs in Georgia fell. And one of the real benefits to this exercise is it gave everybody a better understanding of what the R3 process is. At the end of the meeting, they discussed immediate recommendations and next steps. The top two immediate needs were to finalize this memorandum of understanding, which ended up happening in October of 2015, and then to hire an R3 coordinator, which happened in December of 2015, and that's when I came on board. And this position was a cooperative agreement. If I understand correctly, it's the first of its kind. And it was cooperation between Wildlife Resources Division, National Wild Turkey Federation, Safari Club International, Quality Deer Management Association, and the Georgia Wildlife Federation. So the cooperative approach is very important because previously organizations tended to operate within organizational silos. And if you take a step back and look at it, any one organization trying to take on the burden of R3 alone is certain to be met with somewhat limited success. So they wanted to make sure this was a joint effort. My job duties in a nutshell or to form a strategic approach for Georgia and then act as a conduit between organizations to ensure we're taking the most efficient path forward by targeting the correct audiences and properly evaluating our efforts. So there's quite a few things in my scope of work. But we definitely want to get around to what we're here to talk about today, which is building the state-specific plan off of the foundation provided by the National Hunting and Shooting Sports Action Plan, or as many people call it, stepping down the plan. So the first step here, I have a bachelor's and master's in wildlife biology, which gives me a deeper understanding of conservation funding. However, I certainly did not have a deep understanding of R3. There is no R3 degree currently. I didn't learn about it in school, and at that time, there wasn't really any formal R3 training. So to get that deeper understanding of what R3 was and a foundation to work off of for this plan, I dove into a literature review. So I started with some light reading, like the National Hunting and Shooting Sports Action Plan. I definitely tore through that, got into some of the peer refereed goodness that everybody loves, and of course the technical reports as well, and even some popular articles. State-specific reports were certainly very important to this process, so I could find out what specifically was going on in Georgia and what had been evaluated previously. By the end of it, I had read through about 2,000 pages of R3 related documents and had definitely lost any semblance of a social life. But it was okay because I knew a lot more about R3. So with that background information, the next step was to begin conducting a sample inventory. The goals of this inventory were twofold. The first one being it helped me build the stakeholder base. It gave me a reason to reach out to stakeholders in Georgia, let them know who I am, what we're doing, what R3 is, and really setting the stage there. And then obviously, as the inventory implies, it gave me a general idea of the status of R3 in Georgia. So I moved forward with some pretty simplistic questions. Name of the program, contact person, partners and sponsors. This one was important to me because I wanted to see who was already working in a cooperative manner and what industry partners supported R3 efforts in Georgia currently. Target audience, target activity. I definitely wanted to look at the current advertisement. Are they advertising to people that already hunt? Are they advertising in a manner that suits the target audience that they've set forth? Evaluation and follow-up. Do they have any idea what the outcomes are? And then, I'm definitely focused on outcomes as opposed to outputs, but I still wanted to know the number of participants because that allowed me to gauge the size of the program and take a look at the capacity of those organizations that were hosting those programs. So I took this information and I dropped it right into the R3 mapping process here, which is an iteration of the outdoor recreation adoption model. And I separated it, youth and adult, tried to look at what was going on in Georgia. And you see all the different programs on here, and the names are not important. I just wanted to get a general initial idea. So I did it for hunting and shooting in Georgia. After I had all of this information, I had the background knowledge, I met with a few of the stakeholders. I had a better idea of what was going on in Georgia. So really quickly, I'm not going to go into the details of everything. But the good things we have going on, we're constitutionally protected. We have a large economic impact hunting and shooting sports do in Georgia. There's an upward trend in participation actually with hunting participation since 2009. We have apprentice licenses, theoretically reducing that barrier, the hunter education barrier. We have decent public access and really good private access as well. And most importantly, we have substantial support and effort being put towards R3 in Georgia. All right, the bad. We definitely have a high churn rate. Nationally, there's a lack of awareness about how hunting supports conservation. And in my mind, societal acceptance is definitely a precursor to increasing participation. So this one is important. Our R3 programs, certainly youth heavy and recruitment heavy. Um, from what I've seen with the inventory, the advertising, and by going to a few of these programs myself, we were certainly hitting the spouses and the youth of the existing base of hunters. And we were missing audiences such as millennials, locavores, and urban audiences, which have been theorized to be more efficient audiences, or at least audiences that we need to include. So I took all of this information and I took it to my plan work group. My plan work group is made up of representatives from the sporting organizations. It's also my steering committee. I presented them review and inventory that I put together. I also gave everybody the National Hunting and Shooting Sports Action Plan, and we pulled it all apart and took a look at what could be applicable to Georgia and how we're going to incorporate what's already going on. So the biggest question left there was we needed to determine objectives for the Georgia plan. Before I could start drafting a plan, I needed to know where we wanted to head with it. So I gave my plan work group 3 options. I laid out the options and detailed the pluses and minuses for them. So the options were we could either focus this plan solely on hunting, we could do hunting and shooting sports as they relate to hunting, or we could go after hunting and shooting sports equally. So let's take a look at that really quick. Shooting, and I'm speaking in generalizations here. So in general, booming participation, it's less complex, it's easily scheduled, there's no restricted seasons, and in reality, one quality trial opportunity can provide someone with the skills that they need to somewhat proficiently continue that activity on their own afterwards. Whereas hunting certainly requires a greater level of skills development, trial opportunity, mentorship, and expense from a time standpoint, potentially monetarily, depending on which specific activities you're looking at. So due to the booming participation in shooting sports versus hunting and the complexity of creating a hunter, we decided this plan would primarily target hunting participation. However, we wanted to recognize the importance of shooting sports and the role they play in the process an individual goes through to become a hunter. You know, they give them that mechanical head start. That's why, in addition to hunting, we were going to include shooting sports as they relate to hunting. So for our purposes, targeting both equally was not deemed wise, but we did not want to leave out shooting sports completely. All right, so here's what we ended up with for our goals: to increase participation in hunting and shooting sports as they relate to hunting, and to increase societal acceptance and support of hunting and shooting sports in Georgia. With these objectives, the background information that I had, I dove into writing this first draft. So I went into my cubbyhole of an office and I got to it for a few months. Thankfully, I took a selfie, so I had something to put on this slide. And I restructured the pertinent action items and incorporated the state level details that were identified. I called Matt Dunphy a lot. At this time, Samantha Petter was not in her current role. I believe now she would be the correct contact for this kind of information. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Matt was extremely helpful with brainstorming. And then we conducted work group meetings moving forward. So I completed the draft. I felt like it was a solid plan. I was pretty excited about it, but there was one issue. At this point, we had a prescriptive plan. Like many other plans that are prescriptive, it was likely going to collect dust on a shelf somewhere. So what we wanted was a consensus plan to ensure that we had stakeholder buy-in, which would hopefully result in cooperative implementation. And this consensus plan required a stakeholder meeting. So I spoke with Matt Dunphy with the Wildlife Management Institute, Mandy Harlan over the NWTF. They've both hosted or been parts of similar meetings. So I brainstormed with each of them to find out what works and what doesn't. with their input from my steering committee, and input from the professional facilitator that we used for this meeting, I pulled together an agenda for the 2016 Georgia R3 Summit. The purpose of this meeting is to update stakeholders on R3 in Georgia, the status of R3, evaluate the programs that are currently in place, and then most importantly to this webinar, receive stakeholder input on the draft Georgia Hunting Action Plan. So we held this summit in September of 2016. There were 31 stakeholders with a vested interest in hunting and shooting sports there. I went over the status of R3 in Georgia, essentially a very detailed version of the brief good versus bad we just talked about in the past few slides. And this summit was designed to be interactive and included 2 breakout sessions. So we had our R3 mapping breakout session. During this mapping exercise, the breakout groups used the map derived from the outdoor recreation adoption model to assess where Georgia R3 programs landed. So if you look at this map, it can be used for almost any activity, but for the purposes of these sessions, we wanted to focus on hunting R3. So we still mapped shooting programs, but only as they related to hunting R3. Each person in the group was guided by a facilitator to provide detailed descriptions of the programs they were involved in, the intent of each program, and what the actual results were. Then the group decided as a whole where that program would fall within the R3 spectrum, and it was placed on the map. So the facilitator did not tell them where to put the program. I was floating around the rooms. I would give advice, but we wanted the group to decide where that program went. And we made it very clear that this was not an exercise of good or bad. This is solely an inventory and allows us to get a better understanding of R3, just take a look at where gaps exist. So mapping exercise allowed for self and group evaluations of a large majority of the programs that we have in Georgia. There was certainly a wow factor for the participants, and that was the visual of many of the programs falling under the recruitment section of the R3 map. As you can see here, there's 4 images from each of the 4 breakout groups, and it's pretty solid down the left side there, the recruitment side. There was certainly program overlap across groups, and the R3 mapping process is subjective. However, it was clear there was a large amount of effort being devoted to recruitment in Georgia. So this exercise facilitated discussion on what exactly an R3 program is. It informed stakeholders about other programs going on in the state and provided visual confirmation of where those gaps exist. And this might be a little bit of a reach, but if continued on an annual basis, it will provide a form of trend data as the results on the map shift. It'll be loose trend data, but nonetheless could provide images for a graphic showing the shift after the initiative was put into place. All right, then the fun began. We started the action item breakout session, which was used to ensure the final version of the Georgia Hunting Action Plan would be a consensus plan as opposed to a prescriptive plan like we talked about earlier. So each stakeholder received an electronic version of the draft plan a week prior to the summit for review. We gave them a hard copy that morning when they arrived, and we also made it available to them on the National R3 site under the Georgia R3 Initiative group so they could download it at their leisure. This initial draft contained 18 action items. Each group received 4 minutes per action item to give feedback on the action itself and the associated tasks. We used that format and limited the time to stay away from the stories about that time you took little Bobby hunting and it was the best experience of your life. While those stories are excellent, we were trying to be very productive. We didn't have a lot of time. And one of our steering committee members had actually been to a meeting where they limited the time in this fashion, and the results definitely better than if you just left it open for discussion. And I think it worked very well. So the facilitator prompted the group with questions during these 4 minutes about the clarity, appropriateness, and what was missing from each action item. Each room had a designated note taker that captured the group's comments into a Google document. So this Google Doc was projected on a screen in each room. You can see the facilitators at the top of the columns there, and then on the left side. It was a live document, so the rooms could see what was going on in the other rooms, and it sparked new ideas across rooms. And I'll just say that technology is really cool, and I think this idea worked very well. So I took this information, compiled it into one master table. We had a few more meetings, a few more rounds of edits, and of course a few more phone calls to Matt. And then I ended up with the fall 2016 version, the Georgia Hunting Action Plan, by restructuring the pertinent action items in the national plan, incorporating state level details that we identified, conducting those work group meetings, and probably most importantly, incorporating that stakeholder feedback from the meeting. This resulted in the Georgia Hunting Action Plan with 19 action items. The idea here is that it's going to be updated each year after the annual R3 Summit. That will keep it relevant to the initiative that we have going on in Georgia. We can add items as needed, remove items, and just make sure that we stay on top of it and we keep it moving forward. So let's jump in here and look at the plan structure really quick. You have your general front matter, introduction, background, objectives, all that good stuff. And then you jump into the meat and potatoes of it, which is the strategy. Under the strategy, you have justification. Essentially, it's a background with reference literature illustrating why the strategy is important. Then you jump down into the action items, the actual action that needs to occur, implementation, who's responsible for implementing said action, and then the tasks, which are those recommended tasks to complete the action or further identify what's needed to complete that action. So you'll see here the first one I built in some job security with action item number 1, maintaining a statewide position. But in all seriousness, that is certainly an important one. If you're going to have a state level approach here, you definitely need at least one person, ideally multiple people devoted to solely R3 in your state. Then you'll see the implementation there, cooperative funding from stakeholders. Let's take a look at another example real quick. Creating a database of available mentors. The implementation is going to be carried out by the mentor committee. So let's talk about implementation. Implementation, some of it's going to fall on me. I'm working with multiple action items, piloting programs. Some will fall on identified stakeholders. The Wildlife Resources Division certainly will play a large role in a lot of them. And then we've developed these Georgia R3 initiatives, committees, to really, it's kind of an effort to maintain momentum, keep those stakeholders engaged, and spread out the workload. So we developed 5 committees. They are chaired by a stakeholder with expertise in the identified realm, contain representation from multiple organizations, and then I participate in each one. So the initial steps of these committees were to scope out the tasks with the associated action items that they've been assigned, determine specific direction, investigate funding if needed, develop a brief work plan or a timeline, and then look into what implementation steps are needed. So we've got 5 committees. 3 of these have met at least once. This plan was finalized in January, and we've been moving forward with these committee meetings. One of the committees has already had 2 meetings. I've actually got a committee meeting tomorrow, but it seems like a pretty good approach so far. This was the best way we could figure out how to do it, and we've got a lot of hopefully productive ideas coming out of these, and we're moving forward with a lot of interesting things that have been come up with by these Georgia R3 initiative committees. One other thing I want to dive into really quick, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this. If you have questions about it later, I'd be happy to send you some information. But under the Georgia Hunting Action Plan, we're going after some pilot programs because one of the actions in there talks about targeting non-traditional audiences. So following the guidelines of the plan, we are doing pilot programs that target non-traditional audiences, using relevant mentors, incorporating that pre, post, and follow-up evaluation, We're piloting participant tracking so we can look at the real outcomes if they ever purchase hunting licenses again after these programs. And then we're providing follow-up and next steps as a part of each program. And the biggest part here is if we feel like the program's an initial success, if that audience is a viable audience, then we want to encourage replication. So let's look at a couple really quick, and I'm going to, like I said, do this very quickly. But Field to Fork, we went after locavores at farmers markets. We put them through the classroom sessions, gave them crossbow training since crossbows might initially be more palatable to this audience than firearms. We took them out hunting. You can see I'm big on the selfies there. Everybody had a really positive experience, judging by the evaluations that we received. We had quite a few harvests, and then we actually had a follow-up social where we had our conservation partners there. You can see Lynn Lewis Weiss, the conservation field manager for the National Wild Turkey Federation, came and cooked some dishes. We used venison from the harvested animals. We had everybody tell their hunting stories and provided them with follow-up next steps, where to go from here. And there's the group. It was a pretty good program. We had a very diverse group. We had a nutritionist, Parks and Rec guy, a vegetarian school teacher, organic farmer, a chef, college students. I mean, it was certainly a great course. Now the replication part of that, we're going to incorporate, I'm working with Hank Forster of the Quality Deer Management Association, and we're going to take one of their chapters and integrate them into this program in the future to encourage replication. All right, the Warnell Learn to Hunt. Going after college students was another big one that we wanted to try out in Georgia, since a lot of the literature suggests this is probably a pretty efficient audience. The good thing about going after the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia was that these students are wildlife students. They already have an understanding of how hunting benefits conservation. A lot of them just came from urban areas, didn't have the avenue to get into hunting, but they have the interest. So we've developed this course, put them through classroom training. We actually took them on a squirrel hunt. I love this picture. We did some squirrel cleaning exercises that initial night. You see Hank Forster there giving some shotgun training to one of the participants. And then we've got Nathan with a few squirrels that he harvested on one of the hunts. And of course, we did a follow-up dinner as well to provide next steps. Everybody tried some squirrel pot pie. It was definitely initially seems to be a success. We're providing them with a sporting clays opportunity in the future and a deer hunt. And both of these programs were cooperative approaches involving multiple organizations. But the big thing is that replication. So for instance, with this college program, we had the University of Georgia Wildlife Society chapter and the NWTF chapter involved. And we're appointing hunt coordinators for those chapters to help facilitate the program in the future and take on a lot of that burden of the planning. All right, I just wanted to cover those pilot programs. So recommendations, what did I learn from this whole process of building this state-specific plan? One, definitely determine the objectives before engaging stakeholders. I was on board 5 months before we had our objectives solidified, and that can potentially create issues as you're trying to spread the message to the stakeholders and let everybody know what you are doing. Definitely hold an R3 summit. I know a lot of states are doing the initial one, but once you have an R3 coordinator on board and you're moving forward, if you want to do a state level plan, make sure you get a draft together and then you have that summit to make sure you're taking a consensus approach and you don't end up with a prescriptive plan. When you're dealing with all of these cooperators, you can't really tell anybody to do anything, so you have to make sure that they are bought in to the approach that you're taking, so you need their input. Consider starting a state page on the national site. We can jump on and look at this in a little bit, but this was definitely very helpful. I started a Georgia R3 initiative page. You can make it a private group, so only people you invite are in there. And I used it to host the draft plan so people could download it electronically. I've been throwing up Georgia related information here and there. every now and then, and it's been a very useful tool. And probably the biggest thing, remember this is all new. Um, I hate to state it like this, but it's kind of a shot in the dark. You know, the R3 in itself is new. It's a new field, and certainly creating a state level plan is a new process. So we took the best approach that we could identify, taking all the steps that we've mentioned here today. We think that our implementation steps with the committees are the right way to go. However, only time will tell. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but it's certainly new, and there's certainly going to be a lot of trial and error moving forward to see what works and what doesn't. I certainly want to thank all of the sporting organizations, Wildlife Resources Division, NWTF, Safari Club International, Quality Deer Management Association, Georgia Wildlife Federation, and Matt Dunphy working under Whisper, helping put this plan together. And that is my contact info. If we don't get all the questions answered today or you have any follow up, please always feel free to shoot me an email.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. That was a great presentation. We're going to take some questions now. Before we do that, we're going to send out a little poll here. If you see it off to the right-hand side above the chat box, we'd just love to hear your answer on that if it applies to you. But go ahead and start asking your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side, and we'll just start rolling through them. So the first one, the first couple, we got some people wanting to know about some numbers. So the first one would be, how are you guys calculating your churn rate? By what percentage did you anticipate increasing the number of hunters in Georgia? And then also, how are you going to measure your social acceptance of hunting and shooting sports? So churn rate, anticipate of the increase, how much percentage do you anticipate the increase of hunters, and then how are you measuring social acceptance?
All right. The churn rate, the numbers that I went off of for the purpose of this plan was a 2011 study done by Southwick. However, the current churn rates are definitely being looked at, and that's handled by Jennifer Wisniewski, and she is the marketing communications manager with the Wildlife Resources Division. So I'm not exactly sure on the methodology of calculating those churn rates, but I can certainly find out for you from her and let everybody know.
All right.
Marty, are we going to be able to provide any kind of follow-up after this for questions I'm not able to answer today, or
yeah,
should they just reach out to me?
Yeah, we'll make a note down to reach out. Okay, so that was just my question. I was just kind of interested, but all right, next one would be, by what percentage do you anticipate increasing the hunter percentage in Georgia with your initiative?
Man, that's a tough question. we do not have a goal in mind. We did not set those types of goals in this plan. We certainly want to make sure that we increase participation, but we also initially want to make sure that we have this strategic approach in place and we're not jumping the gun and just focusing on the numbers. So we want to make sure that we have quality programs that focus on the outcomes. And I think we'll have a better idea of how much we actually want to increase or what's reasonable once we pilot this tracking program and start to see how effective these different actions and programs that we're doing are.
And then the last one was, how are you guys measuring societal acceptance for the sport of hunting and shooting sports? Sorry.
Is this Dean Mitchell in Utah hitting me with these hard questions?
Yeah, it looks like it.
I used to think he was a nice guy, but I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, that is a really good question. And we don't have a metric to look at societal acceptance. That's certainly something that we're going to be working with the marketing committee to figure out, because we don't want to just throw marketing out there and, it's it's a hard thing to calculate, definitely. And we're working on it with a marketing committee. I guess would be the best answer there.
Mhm. Did you guys engage any retailers in your plan work group?
Not in the work group itself, but in the meeting, yeah. So we we've actually had a partnership with Cabela's. The Cabela's Outdoor Fund provided a grant for Georgia to pilot some adult programming, which we're very grateful for. And so I've been in contact with the retail marketing managers at the stores in Georgia. I just had a meeting with one of them over in one of the locations the other day. So we would certainly like to incorporate um, more retailers and more industry in the future. One of the big things that I was a little bit disappointed about is that we didn't have a whole lot of industry representation that we hosted. And I was debating about, how to increase that in the future. And then I actually had a conversation with Dan Forrester, who's the director of government relations for the ATA. And he said, you certainly want their participation, but it might be better and it might be more efficient if you bring them in a little bit later once you have that strategy in place and once you know what you need from them as far as sponsorships and support, because they're certainly very busy. Not that everybody is not, but they're moving full steam ahead right now.
All right. Gus wants to know, is each state set up with a similar organizational structure as Georgia?
Each state.
So
What
should
is
the
Gus
should
about?
should other states be able to easily kind of replicate what the process that you've done in their state?
I think that would be up to the individual state, but as far as creating a cooperative position, that is certainly an option in each state, I would assume. As far as the actual structure of the state agencies, I don't know enough to
Hmm,
answer that accurately.
okay. Lynn asked, in retrospect, what would you have done differently through the process?
Um, that's a good question. I definitely would have tried to hammer out the objectives earlier. I think that's one thing that slowed us down a little bit, but making sure you've clearly defined your objectives and everybody knows it would be a really good first step. What are you going to focus on, as we talked about earlier? But all in all, I think that especially for a first stab at it, the first state going this route, I think and that was thanks in part to all of the partners involved. We had some very passionate people involved, and we're able to get this knocked out in develop a quality plan in a fairly short amount of time, all things considering.
Hmm,
So the biggest thing to me is just make sure you clearly define your objectives.
all right. Um, did you end up posting a copy of the Georgia plan to the um, overall group, R3 group, or is it still just in your Georgia group?
Let me show you real quick.
Somebody was just wanting to access a copy of the plan. Is that available to
So,
everybody now?
so can you see my browser right now,
Um,
or
try
is it
try
still
to
the
try
PowerPoint?
to share your screen again.
Oh, did it go away?
Yeah, it went away for. Yep, here it comes. And we
Okay.
will, in the follow-up email, we'll send that out, as well as if you search the R3 community website, that's nationalr3plan.com, and search for the Georgia National Plan. It should pop up there. And if it's not in there,
Are you
we'll
seeing
make
that?
sure we get it.
Are you seeing that browser now?
Yep, we see the browser.
Okay. So if you type in, just go Georgia Plan, you'll pull it up, and this one's actually in the private group, but you won't see that if you're not in the group. And it should be right there, Georgia Hunting Action Plan. So you can click on it. There's my obnoxious logo.
Huh.
Um, a brief description about it, and then you've got the plan right here in all the appendices. And it's amazing how useful this site is. You just click on the plan, There it is, downloaded. So you've got everything right there at your fingertips. And I do want to point out, if you're having a summit, one of the appendices in this plan is the Georgia R3 Summit summary. So you can go there and take a look at the exact process that we used and some of the results and the images in there and the table as well that I compiled. So it's some good information if you're looking at doing something similar.
Awesome. Yeah. So you can get that off the National R3 Plan site. All right. Hank Forrester asked if this is being recorded, and yes, it is. I will be posting this YouTube video to the R3 community website here later this week, so be looking for that on the website. If you're not a part of the community, please join. We'll send out bi-weekly newsletters where it'll just kind of summarize what's going on in the website and keep you up to date. So you can access that there. All right. Gus says, I'm a big advocate of the cooperative extension since they have a presence in every county with community education programs for all ages. Is Georgia Extension Service one of your participating stakeholders?
They're not currently. We're talking about trying to get them involved. We have the University of Georgia Extension involved. We're trying to get them more involved. Dr. Mark McConnell has just started over there as a new extension professor, so we're working with him on some outreach stuff. But as far as getting the general cooperative extension involved, that's definitely something we need to do.
Great. And then what is the funding what's the funding mix for your program?
All right, so the position has funding or support in some form from all of those mentioned partners. So let's take a look here. You've got the National Wild Turkey Federation putting in funds, Georgia Department of Natural Resources puts in funds, the Safari Club International, both the Atlanta chapter and the Georgia State chapter put in funds. The Quality Deer Management Association puts in funds. The Georgia Wildlife Federation contributes office space as well as meeting space. So like we had an R3 summit there, and they've been very helpful with some of the other things as well. So all of the partners involved are supporting in some fashion, and it is truly a cooperative position.
All right. Just waiting for some more people to submit questions here. So for those of you that are looking to start stepping down your state plans and whatnot, the Council to Advance Hunting and Shooting Sports is actually offering workshops that you can sign up to be a part of. Sam is going to post a link to find out some more information about that here in a little bit, and in the follow-up survey. So go ahead and be looking out for that. But yeah, it's a one-day workshop where you can sit down with Sam and Matt Dunphy, and they'll pretty much do a lot of what Charles did there and start breaking out, all of your programs, mapping them out, go through the outdoor recreation adoption model, stuff like that. So it's a great workshop. They've worked with quite a few states already. All right, ready for another question? Are you getting WRA funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or are they just a cooperator?
So the funding that I'm receiving is coming directly from the cooperators listed. So the Wildlife Resources Division, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, NWTF, Safari Club International, KDMA, Georgia Wildlife Federation, etc.
Yep. Has Georgia dropped any activities or programs that didn't fit the adoption model?
No, we have not. We have not dropped any programs currently. We're in the process. So this is still in the very early stages. So we're very still in the very early stages. We've got our strategic approach in place, and we are piloting new programs. We're definitely not dropping programs right now, though. We may in the future. Of course,
Okay.
that'll be up to the individual organization that hosts those programs. But we are simply going to pilot what we would call non-traditional programs and then encourage replication of those.
Alrighty. And we got one more here. Has there been any major hurdles building the plan since you're not a state employee?
I would definitely say that did not come into play at all. So the state is I'm actually currently a state employee, but the state is a very large cooperator in this. They're very devoted to R3, and since they are a backing partner, I haven't had any issues from that standpoint at all. Our past director, Dan Forrester, was very devoted to R3, and our current director, Rusty Garrison, has been involved in many R3 programs in the past, and he's just as devoted, if not more devoted. So we're in a good shape as far as the state agency goes, and I haven't had any issues with anybody questioning the initiative if that's the line of thinking that we're going down there.
Alrighty. I think we're going to wrap it up here since we've had a little bit of technical difficulties and the questions are kind of dwindling down here. So I just want to thank everybody for participating and listening to Charles and Charles's presentation on how to step down the national plan into a state plan. Please, we're going to send out a survey here. Samantha just posted that to the chat box. You can access it there. Also, if you RSVP'd earlier, we're going to send out just kind of a follow-up with some links and some of that survey there. So please give us your feedback. We love to hear what you think about these. We want to try and make these as useful for you guys as possible with the most engaging information out there. These are monthly, so be on the lookout for next month's webinar. And I think that about does it. Thanks again, Charles, and everybody have a great rest of the week. Take care.